It is my privilege to moderate this session on changes in international economic order and task for Asian regional economic integration together with such distinguished panelists. I think that the topic of this session is very timely and relevant in light of the three aspects. Firstly, the global trading system established, promoted, and sustained by the United States is currently facing the most serious challenge to date because of the doubtful US commitment to this system and the rising worldwide trade protectionism, I mean. Secondly, as the US wants to fundamentally change the Chinese economic model, it does not bode well for a quick resolution of the current trade conflict between US and China. Even if current conflict may avoid hard landing temporarily, it will continue in the years to come, affecting the world economy in general and global supply chain in particular. Lastly, the Doha round is nowhere, and it is not even clear whether Doha round is dead or not, casting doubt over the future of multilateral trade liberalization. The US-China relations of serious concern to all Asian countries, since these two countries are Asian nations' #1 and #2 partner, not only in trade but also on overall relations, and the export is still the major growth engine of this region. I hope our distinguished panelists, 2 speakers and 3 discussants here present this afternoon can enlighten us what we should do and how the Asian regional economic integration can contribute to the rule-based international trading system, which is one of the key elements of the sustainable development of this region. Now, I'd like to introduce our panelists today. On my left-hand side, Dr. Pasha Xue, Professor of Law at Singapore Management University. On my right-hand side, Dr. Akihiro Tamura, Professor at National Graduate Institute for Policy Studies of Japan. And next to him is Dr. Yeol Son, the Professor of Yonsei University, Korea. And on the far left is Dr. Deok-nan, Professor of Seoul National University, Korea. And far right-hand side is Dr. Hyun Jung-jae, General Manager of Korea International Trade Associations. And rapporteur is the Dr. Hyo-young Lee of Korea National Diplomatic Academy. I would like to invite first Dr. Tamura to make a presentation. I do not intend to speak long on his bio, which is very impressive, but he has been working at Ministry of Economy and International Trade, METI, of Japan for nearly 30 years, and we are expecting him to come back to METI anytime soon this year. Okay? So he will talk on T20 Task Force Policy Brief of the G20. As you know, Japan is the chair country of the G20. So he is now involved in the T20 Task Force. So he will make a presentation on its brief on trade, investment, and globalization. Dr. Tamura, you have the floor. You have the floor. Yeah.
Should I go?
Yes, please.
Good afternoon. 안녕하세요. My name is Aki Tamura. Right now, Dr. Lee introduced me as, how should I say, the former Japanese trade diplomat and have some experience in trade policy. Currently, I'm with the university called GRIPS, the National Graduate Institute for Policy Studies, which is Japan's national university focused on policy studies, as you can see from the name. Until 2 years ago, I was with the government, where I had been working for 30 years. So I have some experience as as to the government official on this field. But what I'm going to speak about this afternoon is, as you can see from the screen, the T20. T20 is, as you know, that T20 sounds quite similar to G20. G of G20 is government 20. T of T20 is think tank, think 20. Other than T and G, we have so many other some 20, such as B20, which is business 20. I heard that there is a W20, a women 20. There are many, something 20. But what I'm going to talk about this afternoon is about T20, which I was involved in this year, as the chairman introduced. This year is Japan's presidency year for G20, and naturally T20 also is going to be chaired by Japan. And I was, as you know, that of course, you know, the structure of entire G20 activity changes year by year, reflecting the kind of taste of a presidency country. So therefore, we had the different structure of G20 last year, which was Argentinian year. This year, Japan decided to structure, as you can see, that we have 10 task forces ranging from the 2030. This has to do with the so-called SDGs to the many other policies. But this afternoon, this session is about trade, primarily focused on regional integration in Asian region. Therefore, I also would like to shed a light upon that so-called Task Force 8. Task Force 8 is about the trade, investment, and globalization, which I was involved in. And particularly, I'm going to introduce 3 important policy briefs, which was issued actually last week from out of the Task Force 8. Oops. Actually, the Task Force 8 has 8 policy briefs in total, including like a global supply chain, the small, medium size, something like that. But I'm gonna introduce particularly 3 important papers, policy brief to you today, because it has most relevant to the topic this afternoon. Policy brief 1, titled "The Crisis in World Trade," is expected to function as a kind of umbrella policy brief in relation to the rest of the other policy briefs. Of course, that's why this kind of content of the policy brief is not necessarily focused only on trade, but it talks a little bit more general issue. But in a nutshell, it encourages that actually this is a policy brief addressed to the G20 leaders. So everything is addressed. It is kind of a proposal to encourage a political leader to carry out these kind of policies. So this policy brief 1 encourages the G20 leaders to reinvigorate the multilateral system, accelerates the effort at striking bilateral and regional trade agreement. This must be particularly relevant to the topic this afternoon. And also the other, like for instance, if you look at the second, third line, such as like bilateral trade imbalance, which has been emphasized lately by the United States, can be corrected only through the change in the macro and the structural policies, not necessarily the trade policies. And also the second last point on the screen you can see is that China should rapidly adopt a reform corresponding to its newly kind of now that it's quite large country, therefore they should adopt reform corresponding to their current status. And also last point is that we understand that the U.S. has frustration, concern about the current multilateral trading system, which is considered as legitimate to some extent. Therefore, we try to address that, but U.S. should also engage in this multilateral system instead of leaving that. That is the last point that this policy brief want to emphasize. The second one is more focused on that the one pillar of the WTO system. You know that the WTO has primarily three pillars. One is legislating rule-making pillar. The second pillar is dispute settlement pillar. The third pillar is kind of so-called policy review pillars. And the second policy, the policy briefs too, is focused on the first pillar, which is rule-making, or we can say negotiating forum. And I don't want to get into detail, but it also it emphasizes the importance of pursuing a critical mass approach for the market access agreement, and the model is the environmental goods agreement, which is still in under negotiation, and those TISA, which is somewhat at this moment going nowhere, but all of them, both of them are trying to pursue critical mass market access agreement. Therefore, we should encourage that approach instead of plurilateral as far as market access is concerned. On the other hand, rule agreement, it doesn't have, this screen does not have explicitly, but the model is Bali agreement on the trade facilitation agreement, which is multilateral agreement, but still multi-speed. So that is kind of the most preferable option this paper suggests. And as a kind of topic, the issues, we should prioritize the issues dealt with in the MC11 in the Buenos Aires, ranging from the medium-sized enterprise to the e-commerce investment. All of them already, the like-minded countries launched the exercise. Therefore, we should encourage them to carry on that exercise. And finally, the PB3 is focused on the second pillar, which is DS, dispute settlement. This is a little bit more tricky issue because this is kind of hardcore concern of the United States right now. And there is no easy answer, but if we try to find some question that we can find the easy answer, maybe we can at least locate it in the procedural aspect. So first of all, there are several procedural concerns expressed by the United States, such as how to deal with outgoing appellate body members, and also the deadline of 90 days of appellate body reviews. This kind of thing can be addressed somehow. But on the other hand, more fundamental question, which is judicial activism. This is a kind of fundamental question expressed by the United States, but there is no magic bullet to address this. So therefore, this policy brief 3 suggests annual meeting between the AB and the WTO members. On the other hand, there are several proposals, such as the one issued by the European Union, which is to reinforce the independence of the appellate body, this is not necessarily pushed by this policy brief 3. And on top of that, we also try to come up with some suggestion as to the alternative approaches, such as the so-called Article 25. 25 is arbitration, but this is non-legal solution. So therefore, this is also not the magic bullet, because unless either side agree upon that, it's not going anywhere. And also still that it doesn't mean that neither side can go to the appellate body review. Still they can continue to seek for the appellate body review. Therefore, at least this is not going to end the legal dispute. And also, this suggests what else? I'm sorry, this is the second, this is the third, yes. And also, there is some interesting suggestion. I'm not involved in this, the drafting of this report, that's why I can call it interesting. The countermeasure under the general international law, because even though that the dispute settlement system written within the DSU is not functioning, since that the DSU or WTO legal system is part of the larger general international law. Therefore, DSU does not deprive the WTO member from exercising the legal right under the general international law. But still, there is a kind of debatable whether this is possible or whether this is workable is also some maybe still debatable. Anyway, I stop here introducing that policy briefs of T20, and finally I conclude with my remarks by making some reference to some thought for the Asian regional economic integration. As I introduced the policy brief 1, also suggested that in order to salvage multilateralism, like-minded countries can engage in the regional integration processes. So therefore, for instance, us, Asian, has already some exercise ongoing, such as TCP, TPP, and RCEP, and other connectivity initiative hinted for instance, some infrastructure connectivity initiatives such as Belt and Road. So these are, the CPTPP, RCEP, these are kind of legal connectivity initiative. On the other hand, Belt and Road and Indo-Pacific, these are more kind of focused on infrastructure. All of them are for the sake of enhancement of connectivity. They can be, they should be carried out to not only for the sake of interest of the region, but also to save the multilateralism. So maybe in the process of the question, the Q&A process, we can be engaged in how we can carry out this exercise. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Tamura. Thank you for your sharing the policy brief prepared by the T20 of the G20. Our next speaker is Dr. Xie, professor at Singapore Management University School of Law. He is an expert particularly in ASEAN law and the role of China and Taiwan in international legal order. He will make a presentation on New Asian regionalism today, particularly focusing on RCEP negotiations.
Sure.
Dr. Xie, you have a floor. Or you can stay here or yeah.
Maybe I just stay here. Okay, thank you very much, Ambassador Lee, for your very kind introduction. Today, I will speak on New Asian regionalism from legal and trade perspective. In particular, I'll address issues on the RCEP, CPTPP, as well as the impact of the U.S.-China trade war. Well, now let me first provide some theoretical framework for global regionalism. Columbia law professor coined the term first regionalism, which referred to many initiatives in the 1960s largely failed for political reasons. He also noticed some successful stories in the second regionalism in 1980s, including NAFTA, which is now known as USMCA, as well as the European single market. I'd argue that we're now in the third regionalism, which has coincided with the Doha round since the 2000s. The most important development is New Asian regionalism, which has two important elements: the emergence of mega regional trade agreements and South-South free trade agreement, meaning free trade agreements concluded by and between developing countries, including the following: ASEAN Economic Community, which was established in December 2015, CPTPP, also known as TPP 11, which came into effect last year. Now we are negotiating, 16 countries are negotiating RCEP, which are expected to be concluded in November 2019. Well, if it's concluded, it will become the world's largest FTA. As you can see here, 7 countries, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, as well as 4 ASEAN countries are parties to both mega regional trade agreement. Why RCEP can be significant? Of course, it accounts for 28% of the global GDP and covers 50% of the world's population. It includes major trade players in the region: China, India, ASEAN. It will not only consolidate the regional supply chain, but will also consolidate the existing ASEAN Plus One FTA. Currently, ASEAN concluded a bilateral FTA with 6 partners in 5 FTAs, which will make RCEP an ASEAN Plus framework. Okay, so ASEAN now has FTA with Australia and New Zealand, which is ANZ FTA. ASEAN also concluded an FTA with China, ACFTA, which was upgraded in 2015. ASEAN also concluded a separate FTA with Hong Kong in 2019. Same. ASEAN has an agreement with Korea, India, and Japan. But what's the problem here? The problem here is the very low utilization rate. Let me report this. ASEAN-India FTA, only 5.1% exporter actually use FTA. ASEAN-Japan FTA, only 2.3% of importer use FTA. So FTA look great, but nobody use it. So RCEP negotiation must be based on other benchmark. Okay, now let me address the impact of ASEAN US-China trade war since 2018. Trump administration earlier this month decided to raise the tariff on 200 billion worth of Chinese goods from 10% to 25%. It means a synthetic handbag from China is now subject to a 45% tariff. Okay, so naturally it will disrupt the current global original supply chain, but they are winners in this trade war. Number 1 beneficiary is Vietnam because of a new foreign investment. For example, Samsung now makes most of its mobile phone in Vietnam, also making Samsung the largest employer in the country. Thailand also become a very popular place for auto companies to set up their vehicle assembly plant. But people are also concerned about whether or not the U.S. trade war will break ASEAN because it will push Cambodia and Myanmar closer to China. Now let me address the RCEP issues. From the 1990s, there have been 2 major proposals proposed by Japan and China. In order not to be marginalized, ASEAN 10 countries proposed the guiding principles for the RCEP to merge Chinese and Japanese proposals. Both China and Japan agree on the concept of ASEAN centrality, but we should also note that, like CPTPP, ASEAN will not replace current ASEAN Plus One FTA, and RCEP will also put more emphasis on the development issues. Another important issue that most people talk about, whether or not RCEP will become a comprehensive or high-quality FTA. We should know that, different from US-EU FTA or the CPTPP, RCEP will not have provisions on state-owned enterprises or labor rights or environmental protection. Currently, 16 parties have concluded 7 out of 18 chapters of the RCEP. But the core issues remain goods, service, and investment. And of course, e-commerce provisions on data flow and localization will also be very important. So as my colleague, Professor Tamura, pointed out, RCEP coincide with a major trade policy of these countries. For example, China's One Belt and Road initiative, RCEP also benefit India's Act East policy because RCEP is expected to expand India's service trade. ASEAN also put RCEP as a priority in its trade agenda. But we should also know that at the national level, we have challenges. For example, constitutional laws of the Philippines and Indonesia provide that natural resources are owned by or controlled by states, meaning that it will be quite difficult for these countries to increase or allow foreign equity in the mining sector. In terms of trading goods, the number one challenge is tariff elimination. India is the largest challenge because India currently imposes a 50% tariff on agricultural products in order to protect the domestic industry. India is also running a 63 billion trade deficit with China. So India is very concerned about tariff elimination. Another important issue is rules of origin. Okay, because different FTA have different rules of origins. Well, let me raise an example. Now, SIAC Motor, a Chinese auto company, established a vehicle assembly plant in Bangkok. So they want to export completely knocked down unit from China to Bangkok, Thailand, and assemble all the components there and sell the final car, export them to Indonesia and Australia. But what's the problem here? From China to Thailand, no problem because we have ASEAN-China FTA. You can meet the rules of origin, RVC rule 40%, to prove that 40% of the components are actually from the region. But you encounter a problem when you export the car from Thailand to Australia. Although we have Australia-ASEAN FTA, but that FTA does not recognize the cars, the value of the car's Chinese components. Hence, the car will be subject to much higher tariff. So RCEP is expected to solve the problem. Other important issues, such as service liberalizations that concern the movement of professionals. In terms of investment, most people are concerned about investor stay dispute settlement, primarily because of one important case, Philip Morris. This is a tobacco company based in the US, and it brought the challenge against Australia under Australia-Hong Kong BIT, Bilateral Investment Treaty, to challenge Australia's planned cigarette packaging legislation that is intended to reduce smoking. So because of this case, CPTPP and Australia-Singapore FTA have so-called tobacco carve-out clause, which may also affect other FTA as well. India is now subject to many claims. That's why India's stance on ISDS is very conservative. Indonesia, the same. China, surprisingly, now expanded the scope of ISDS. We should also know that EU concluded investment protection agreement with Singapore and Vietnam, also provide for a new mechanism known as permanent investment court system, so that cases can be appealed to a appellate tribunal. So whether or not it will affect ASEAN or ASEAN negotiation, it remains to be seen. And also, like my colleague Professor Tamura pointed out, we now have a problem of trade fragmentation, not just between FTA and WTO. We even face a problem between outer FTA and inner FTA. For example, we are based in Singapore. If we want to sue China, there are 3 FTA, Singapore-China FTA, ASEAN-China FTA, and RCEP. Which one would you use? And different FTA have different provisions. Even more complicated issues arising from conflict between bilateral investment treaty and FTA, which also has ISDS provisions. China and Australia concluded BIT in 1988. They also concluded an FTA in 2015. But the FTA does not replace BIT. So technically, you can, as an investor, you can put a claim under 2 provisions. The international law cannot solve the problem. But on the positive side, those FTA may result in trade multilateralism to achieve the goal of the apex goal of FTAAP, Free Trade Agreement of the Asia Pacific. This is the idea since 2010, but 2019 we also see a problem. China does not. This is the first time that APEC does not issue a joint statement because China is very concerned about the sentence, fighting protectionism, including all unfair trade practices. But on the brighter side, we also hope that open accession clauses of the CPTPP and RCEP can build a foundation for Asian regionalism, which will contribute to a rule-based international order. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Shige, for your excellent presentation. It is really surprising to know that the utilization rate of Japan-ASEAN FTA is so low, less than 3%. Korea-EU FTA utilization arrive around 70%. Korea-US is also the same. So it's really, really surprising.
That's a little bit, you know that, we Japanese business also utilize the bilateral
Yes.
FTA as well. So, yeah, therefore, that doesn't speak everything.
I see, okay, yeah. Okay, then we have three discussants. First, I would like to invite Dr. Dokunan, who is the professor of international trade law and policy and director of Center for International Commerce and Strategy in Graduate School of International Studies at Seoul National University. He is one of the most distinguished professors of Korea in the area of international trade. Dr. An, you have a floor.
Thank you very much for a kind introduction, Chair. Now we have very urgent issue, especially for Korea, for the world trading system because of U.S., China, and many trade problems. As nicely presented by the Tamura and the Pasha, we do have many reasons why this particular reason should work to pursue regional economic integration. Actually, in this part of the world, we have this discussion for a long time. Always we talked about East Asian economic integration or Asian economic integrations and so forth. But let me be more realistic or pessimistic, probably to toss up the idea for the floor discussions. For example, CPTPP, as the Aki nicely explained, it has been one of the most promising, the momentum to drive the regional economic integrations. Now, unfortunately, we miss the United States, but clearly the CPTPP will drive many countries to join in the coming years. But whether the CPTPP can be actually stepping stone for promoting world trading system is actually quite controversial, because U.S. Not simply the escape from the TPP, it actually now have USMCA. So instead of TPP 11, in a way, Canada, Mexico also is kind of absorbed in the USMCA. That means the CPTPP practically can be TPP 9. And then US and Japan actually are talking to each other for having another massive scale trade agreements on goods or FTA, whatever you name it. If Japan has FTA with the US, then whether we still have very meaningful CPTPP arrangement or even TPP will remain as TPP 8 is to be seen in the coming years. For the RCEP negotiation also, RCEP is very important, especially for Korea, because at this moment, this is probably the only way for Korea have some kind of economic relationship with Japan. Or CJK FTA, we actually spent a long time again together, doesn't seem to show much hope to be concluded in any near future. But then RCEP can be very important diplomatic forum to align CJK, the China, Japan, and Korea, in the one integrated economic framework. So in that sense, this can be potentially very, very important regime for East Asian or the Asian economic integrations. But then, again, when Japan joined the bilateral FTA negotiation with the United States, it includes non-market economy provision that was included in the USMCA. It was presented rather diplomatically, but everybody in the trading world has a concern about the implication of this particular provision because it seems to target China. Basically, U.S. seems to block any kind of economic integration with China. Whether the Japan will be bound by this arrangement also we need to see in the future. Another one is RCEP negotiation. After we have CPTPP is actually entered into force, level of the market, the liberalization under RCEP seems to be quite low. Also, the level of the trade rules in the RCEP seems to be rather low compared to CPTPP. So country like Korea, we have quite controversial issue now. Do we have to spend huge political capital to enter and ratify this RCEP, even if we can actually conclude the negotiations when we have alternative option in the CPTPP? So this kind of situation actually raised quite challenging task for regional economic integrations. So because of this huge economic controversy between U.S. and China, the protecting this regional value chain in this part of the world becomes very, very important, more important than ever before. But the current initiative we are doing now under the name of RCEP or the CPTPP, whether this can be actually the solution or the alternative to address the current problem, probably we need a lot of the political commitments and the will among these countries.
Thank you, Dr. Ahn. Then I would like to invite Dr. Yeol-Son, who is the president of East Asia Institute and professor of Graduate School of International Studies at Yonsei University. Dr. Son has written extensively on Japanese and East Asian political economy, Far Eastern international relations, and public diplomacy. Dr. Son, you have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the kind introduction. As moderator just introduced, I am by academic discipline international relations scholar, political scientist. So my comments on two presentation will be political and strategically oriented. So I hope that could be a contribution from me. My comments are three, and I think all three are related. One is that, as Dr. Tamura wrote it, the term crisis in world trade, you use the term crisis, which is quite strong expression, and we mentioned sort of resurgence of protectionism, which is one source of current disruption and crisis. In that sense, obviously, United States is a source of disruption, and maybe you can term it crisis. And Trump populism and protectionism is very well known. And also the other source of disruption is China. China has its own trade barriers, non-tariff barriers, and also many behind the border regulations that are very much protective. And further, as a political scientist, it is called geoeconomics, which means that countries use economic means, for example, trade policy, to serve their own geopolitical goals. In that sense, case in point is Korea, when Korea faced Chinese retaliation, when the Korean government agreed to, deploy American, the weapons called THAAD. And then we see, how the Chinese government used their economic tools to press and affect South Korean foreign policy to its, favor. And also, Professor Shi also mentioned that many cases of free trade agreements in Asia, like China ASEAN FTA, which is in my discipline is called charm offensive by China, that it is not truly an economically or business driven trade agreements, but it is a way to engage ASEAN countries into its orbit. And then we see the competitive movements by Japan, and then Korea followed. So the ASEAN centrality is, in a sense, it is driven not by ASEAN itself as a market or business opportunity. I mean, it is clearly, but also there's a competitive dynamics in the region, so that once it is made, then there are competitive dynamics that move ASEAN into kind of positional advantage in the regional FTA race. So then the upshot is that because it's strategically and politically motivated, the level of liberalization is not so high. So that's probably partly the reason why the utilization is not so high in many cases of free trade agreements in Asia, with the exception of Professor Dr. Lee just mentioned Chorus FTA or EU FTA, and then maybe CPTPP. So we see these sort of strategic rivalries between Japan and China in the 2000s that drive East Asian regionalism, and precisely because of that, it didn't really get the result, positive consequence. And 2010s, we see the similar dynamics that you just mentioned, that RCEP is, in a way, sort of, a counter movement to the development in TPP. And China actively supported, and ASEAN, in that sense, kind of, take a driver's seat to the RCEP negotiation. And similarly, we can apply that political strategic dynamics in that. Then if current U.S.-China rivalry or strategic competition deepens, then the fate of RCEP is not bright. That means that it's a matter of time that there's maybe a breathing space for RCEP negotiation and conclusion before sort of full-fledged strategic competition between United States and China in RCEP or Southeast Asian areas. Already we see Indo-Pacific versus BRI type of thing, and then trade, I think, will not be an exception, as unless RCEP is really moving progressively to the end. So I would also agree with Professor An's sort of assessment of Asian regionalism, that there are many barriers, particularly from a political strategic perspective. The picture is not so promising. So that's my comment. And finally, in terms of strategic cooperation, sort of counter. I think that in order to build a so-called rule-based order that both of you have mentioned, I think which is critical for the countries like Korea, even Japan, and many Asian countries, because two great powers, if they compete and use their muscle, flex muscles to press the middle and the small powers in trade areas, then you see the results. So we need rules-based order that in which great powers are hopefully tamed, or they negotiate under the rules and norms of the multilateral the system. That's really desirable, but it's tall order at the moment or in the near future. Even though that's going to happen, but what we can do is kind of coalition or cooperation among middle powers or the major powers like Japan. And one thing that we are really missing is Japan-South Korea cooperation. Not in politics, but in economics, which we should get over, history, emotions and politics. And we don't really see that happen, see that moving. So I think that's the really important point to which we have to move. So my comment is that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Sun, for your comments. And next, I would like to invite Dr. Hyun Jung-jae, who is currently working as a general manager for international trade at Korea International Trade Association. She is the point person who connects Korea's policymakers with private companies, conducting in-depth studies on the current trade issues which require concerted efforts of public and private sectors of Korea. Dr. Jae?
Okay, thank you, Chairman. Before I start my comments, I would like to ask your understanding, because my comments will focus more on business perspective and focus on the trading goods area, not services, not investment. So let me begin with the necessity of the Asian regional economic integration. So I don't think that many people can deny the fact that Asian economic integration is economically meaningful and necessary and even desirable. And then if you look at the Asian market, you can easily find the potentials. We have a huge population, and ASEAN countries and India has a young population as a future consumers. And then we have resources, and then there are very good industrial bases. So if countries in Asia are more connected and cooperate each other, I think the economic potentials will be far better realized and materialized. But even now, if you look at the real business world, we can say that the Asian region is already integrated, at least in terms of trade and investment. Let me quote some figures. I look at the Korea's trade with Asian countries. So the ratio of Korea's export to Asia was 46.5% in 2001. But the ratio increased up to 63% last year. So I think that this situation is very similar in other Asian countries. So we can say that, the Asia is really integrated. And then, as you can imagine, China is a core of the trade web in Asian countries. So China is #1 exporting destination or #1 importing source for Asian countries. So if we consider this high dependency of trade and investment within Asia, it is very natural for the Asian companies and even multinational companies operating in this region are much interested in the Asian economic integration. So when the RCEP was initiated, so many companies, not only the Korean companies, but multinational companies asked us about the result of the negotiation round by round. So they got much interest in the RCEP. So we can say the companies do want institutionalization of Asian economic integration for their businesses. Then should you welcome the CPTPP in RCEP? maybe yes, but maybe not, because the CPTPP is not a complete integration of Asia. As you know, some important the countries in terms of supply chain are missing, the Korea and Thailand and other Asian countries. So I think that the RCEP is more important when you think about the very important step toward the Asian integration in the future. And I think that if you look at the 16 countries within the RCEP can be more substantially beneficial for the companies and businesses, but only if the members can achieve a high level of market liberalization. So if the RCEP negotiations are concluded by agreeing to a much lower level than the other bilateral FTAs between member countries, then I think that there's no meaning to utilize it at all. So maybe if the RCEP is in a lower level, then not many companies will utilize the RCEP in the future. And then, moreover, I think that it will only add one more spaghetti ball to already complex spaghetti balls. So some people argue that if we achieve the mega FTA, the spaghetti ball effect can be addressed. But if you look at the real world, it's not true. So let me take an example. If we assume that the RCEP enters into force, and if Korea join the CPTPP, and if one company in Korea wants to export to Vietnam, and a company has to compare 4 different FTAs, Korea ASEAN and Korea Vietnam bilateral FTA, and RCEP and CPTPP. I think it's possible for the big companies to compare all the FTA provisions, but for SMEs, it's so burdensome. So we have to check all the tariff schedules and very complicated rule of origin. So I think that the SMEs just rather give up utilizing the FTA. So my point is that for the RCEP to become a meaningful step toward the Asian economic integration in the future, it should achieve high level of liberalization, which can override the other bilateral FTAs. And last point, I don't want to be so skeptical, but I think that the trade conflict between China and the US will affect this route toward the Asian regional integration, because as far as I know, the US wants to become more engaged in the Asian market, but I don't think US wants to see that Asia will be integrated, including China. So as professors mentioned, that's why the US inserted some provision prohibiting the FTA with non-market economy like China. So if I conclude my comments, I don't want to be so pessimistic, but even if we all agree that Asian regional economic integration is very necessary and meaningful and desirable, but there seems to be there is a very long and winding road ahead of us. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Choi. Now we have around 15 to 20 minutes for Q&A. I would like to open the floor for questions from the audience. It's important to get the questions from the audience. So I hope you can make questions as many as possible for the remaining time. If you have any questions, please raise your hand, identify yourself. I think you may be a little shy, so in order to give you more time, I would like to initiate some questions first. You see, there are several comments on RCEP. RCEP try to be a modern, high quality, and commercially meaningful agreement. Do you think China, ASEAN, India can agree to such a high-quality, commercially meaningful agreement? I would like to address these questions to Dr. Xie first.
Well, thank you very much, Ambassador Lee, for the very important questions. I think a lot of people ask this question whether or not RCEP can be a high standard FTA. So my first question is, what does high standard mean? Okay, I think the issue is, what is the benchmark? Okay, so I think a more important question, just like what Ambassador Lee posed, whether or not RCEP can be a commercially meaningful agreement. My answer is positive, because for agreement, we not only look at market access per se. Of course, market access is important. Otherwise, we could just use bilateral FTA. In the case of Japan, why not using RCEP? But other than market access, there are other very important issues which are key to particularly exporters. For example, the harmonization of rules of origin. Okay, what happened in practice now is that every FTA has different rules of origin, and you need to use different form in order to show that you comply with the rules of origin. As my colleague also pointed out, in practice, many SME just give it up. Because they don't have the capacity either to know the rules of origin or to utilize the rules of origin. Secondly, sometimes the MFNTF rate and the FTA preferential rate, the difference is not that huge. So they also give up the FTA preferential rate. The third reason is that in the region, many exports, for example, Korean export or Taiwanese export or Chinese exports, are IT products. And IT products are covered by ITA, Information Technology Agreement, which eliminated duties. So there's no need for them to use the FTA. So back to my point. So we not only look at market access, but we should also look at other issues such as harmonization of rules of origin, the elimination of non-tariff barriers. These are the important issues that are very commercially meaningful for companies. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Xue. My experience as the trade negotiators, rules of origin is always more difficult to negotiate tariff eliminations. Many countries can easily agree to tariff elimination scheme, but they would like to make it futile by strict rules of origin. So I think if the RCEP can produce harmonization of rules of origin, I think it is a very good product for the business community of the region. Yes, I think with only that aspect, we can say it is a high and commercially meaningful agreement. Any questions? I noticed Dr. An Chung-young is present in this room. He is the most senior trade professor of Korea. So I'd like to invite him to make some comments and questions.
No, thank you very much, Ambassador Lee Min, giving me the opportunity. Well, I enjoyed very much listening to the speakers and also discussant. Let me ask this first question. Japan is pursuing bilateral FTA with the United States, and the other day, President Trump mentioned the importance of bilateral FTA when he met the Abe. And then maybe Japan might lose enthusiasm in pursuing the RCEP or some other, the regional agreement. So, in this sense, how you see the, prospect of this RCEP if Japan, lose the momentum. And the second question is that the United States is pursuing Indo-Pacific, the framework encompassing the U.S., India, Japan, and Australia. I know that this is sort of the security, the arrangement for freedom of navigation, but nevertheless, if security, the tie will influence also, regional economic integration. So in this regard, how the Indo-Pacific concept will influence emerging the picture of East Asian economic, regionalism. And the third question, now given the ongoing US and China trade war, maybe regional supply chain here could be divided into two significant parts. One is China-centered supply chain. The other one is, US-centered supply chain. If this happens, on the assumption that the U.S. and China go to, the sort of the brinkmanship, the economic diplomacy ended up no deal until, next G20 meeting. And then maybe, East Asian, the Asian regionalism may go into sort of very complex picture. And I don't know, how we can think of a enlarged the sort of the East Asian, regionalism. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Han. I would like to invite Dr. Tamura first to respond to his questions.
Okay. I suspect that all three questions seem to have been addressed to me, I guess, because somewhat all of your question has to do with my home country. But I guess maybe I have to, I may have a slightly different assumption from yours. I mean, I guess one of your assumptions in your question is that Japan is likely to lose momentum or interest in RCEP or Asian regional integration because of our bilateral relationship with the United States. I don't think any Japanese take that assumption. At least as not only myself, but also all trade expert or business-related people. All of them are quite convinced that we can carry out the both. Both mean that our healthy bilateral relationship with the United States and our pursuit of further regional integration in Asia. So therefore, we already committed to our conclusion of an RCEP negotiation by the end of the year already. So therefore, our position remained the same as to the RCEP because even after Mr. Trump came to Tokyo and left Tokyo, still our commitment to RCEP, the negotiation is the same. And as to the second question, I mean, on Indo-Pacific, as you may know, that this conception itself has been rather introduced first by Japan, not by the United States. U.S. took it. Anyway, of course, this concept has a lot of kind of national security dimension, but as you pointed out correctly, it has economic dimension as well. But as you may know, the economic component of this conception is still under development. Therefore, it's a little bit difficult. It's a little bit too early for me and other person, I guess, to say that what is that. But obviously, people who are engaged in this project are convinced that this economic component of Indo-Pacific initiative or strategy is compatible with other regional economic integration exercise such as RCEP. The third question, I mean, maybe we can later discuss, maybe other panelists are interested in how much the US-China conflict have impact onto the Asian regional integration. That is one important topic. But this again, I'm not sure whether I can share just your assumption, which is that U.S. China the conflict is it's likely to, or it may divide the regional supply chain into two. I mean, at least this conflict is still ongoing, and U.S. and China are trying to find a way out. Therefore, it's a little bit early for us to predict how this conflict between these two large economies have impact onto this region. So, I'm a little bit more cautious about the prediction of how this regional value chain is going to be like because of this conflict. Thank you.
Thank you. And I would like to invite Dr. Son to make further comments.
My comments is on Indo-Pacific and its implications for the regionalism, Asian regionalism. As Professor Tamura just mentioned, the concept is basically a geopolitical concept. So, in other words, when it comes to the region, what kind of region, what concept is embedded in that region. For example, Asia Pacific, then originally it is very much an economic, commercial, right, business-oriented concept. In contrast, Prime Minister Abe and also Trump and others, their conceptualization of Indo-Pacific is geopolitical. Particularly, they look at the maritime security. The Indo-Pacific is basically two oceans connected. So then there's an evolution that because once it becomes very much geopolitical and it sounds like counterbalancing China, some of the countries, particularly from ASEAN, even Singapore is opposed to that kind of conception. Then now the evolution is more toward economics. So now the three main areas of Indo-Pacific cooperation is energy, infrastructure, and governance, and that also includes non-traditional security threats like disaster relief and humanitarian assistance, PKO, etc. So kind of decolored the conventional security. But I think that even though there's some evolution, it is fundamentally about China. And because of that, that is related to Professor An's third question, China, U.S.-China rivalry. Then whether Indo-Pacific can be a regional concept and make it an ism. There's cooperations based on that broader maritime-based, sea power-oriented the region. I kind of doubt that. So this is very much a strategic conceptualization aiming at China in a way, balancing or somehow embracing China under the very strict condition and competing with BRI in that sense. So I think that in the possibility of Indo-Pacific strategy evolving into a bona fide regionalism, I doubt.
I remember that India's entry into Asian regional integration started in 2003 with the concept of ASEAN +3+3. At the time, India mentioned that Asia without India is not Asia. I think it is quite right, and with their policy of look to East, India is actively participating in these regional integrations. In view of the time constraint, I would like to make a final questions regarding Korea and CPTPP. Dr. Han and Dr. Jeju, what do you think? Korea should or can join the CPTPP in near future?
CPTPP is, well, we all know that CPTPP was originated from TPP. That was announced as major economic weapon against China. That was clarified by the Nobel Peace Prize laureate, President Obama. So it was that much clear. So TPP was actually presented as anti-China policy by United States. Now it became the CPTPP, probably the alleviating that element, but still for us, that raised kind of the fundamental diplomatic problems. Whether we joining CPTPP is actually the action against China or not is one issue. Another issue is currently, suddenly because of this very aggravated diplomatic bilateral relationship with Japan, for the first time in Korean history, we now trying to make an accession negotiation. Always we had FTA negotiations, but for CPTPP joining is accession process. So we apply for a accession procedure, and then we have to wait until all the incumbent members approve our applications. And then very embarrassingly, I'm not sure in the Japan situation, but in Korea, in public media, told the many stories about high-ranked officer, high-ranked the prominent political figure in Japan made a statement about their clear intention to block the Korea's accession to CPTPP. That makes the Korean governments very, very difficult to push this agenda, because it looked like the Korean government is trying to apply, despite the major incumbent members' opposition for accession procedure. This is all politically very, very difficult position for Korean governments to pursue. So that is, unless we have very dramatically changed the political circumstance, it becomes the Korean government to push this agenda very, very, very difficult. So that is why in any near future, it's going to be a really difficult challenge for Korea to make an actual accession to CPTPP.
Thank you. Dr. Jeju, from the business perspective?
If I deliver the business perspectives, then the problem is that there are not strong voices that support joining the CPTPP, but there are some industrial parts that are against joining the CPTPP. As you know, the autos and auto parts and some machinery are strongly against joining the CPTPP. The reason is that, if we join the CPTPP, that means that we have a new FTA with Japan and Mexico. Of course, some industries like steels really want to have an FTA with Mexico, but Japan, it's a totally different picture. So whenever I meet the auto companies, they want me to speak out. So we are against CPTPP. So and then some other parts, the agricultural parts, they have also concerns about the opening our agricultural market to Australia, New Zealand, and other agriculture exporting countries, because we opened more to the USA than Australia, New Zealand, and other countries. So if the business world, as long as there are not strong voices that want CPTPP, then I think that auto and automakers, some industries are against the CPTPP will prevail. Then I think we cannot say that we have to join the CPTPP in near future.
Thank you. Yeah. I'd like to conclude this session by saying two comments. See, the reason why the countries participate actively in the Uruguay round negotiations led by United States is to put an end to the unilateral action by the United States through the Section 301. And therefore, the crown jewel of the Uruguay round negotiation is the creation of dispute settlement. So all the unilateral action is prohibited. All the sanctions should go through WTO dispute settlement. But this mechanism is now broken. It's not only by the United States. China is also silently violating WTO rules. If not the letters, the spirit, that can be vividly demonstrated by their sanction against Korea regarding THAAD deployment. U.S. use legal ground, which is not appropriate, security deception through the Section 232, sanctions on steel and aluminum. But they pointed out the legal ground, but China didn't mention at all. Since there is no action from the government, we could not bring this case to the WTO. But the end result is the same. Retaliation in spite of WTO regulations. And secondly, we should remember the Bogo Declaration. Bogo Declaration, the APEC countries adopt Bogo Declaration stating that the APEC country will establish trade and investment liberalization region by 2010 for developed countries, 2020 for developing countries. At this time, no one talks about Bogo declarations. It's totally forgotten. So I think we should not repeat the mistake of the Bogo Declaration. You know, Bogo Declaration, they created concept for the first time, open regionalism. It is a very ambitious one following the Uruguay round negotiations. And last week, Martin Wolf, the columnist of Financial Times, wrote an article regarding China-US trade conflict. The remaining countries should establish coalition of the willing to preserve international rule-based trading system. I think Asia should actively participate in creating the coalition of rule willing through concluding high quality of RCEP agreements and actively participating in the CPTPP expansion. Thank you very much. I would like to conclude this session. Thank you for your attention.